Hi, good morning, everyone. What we'll do is that we'll start off in 30 seconds. I know that there's lots of information to go through on this webinar. And so if you have a question that you want to pose to our panelists, Mark, Layla, and Adrian, please do so. You can do this in two ways, as ever. First of all, in the chat and also in the Q&A, where your details won't be shared with anybody but yourself, by the way.
Philip, will we get a copy of the slides?
You get a copy of the slides, and yeah, this is a no hands raising, so you can't do this. Apparently this is barred. Yeah, that's not. Yeah, so no hands raising at all. Just please share and post your questions or comments in either the chat or the Q&A. Yes, and a copy of the slides will be made available to you there afterwards. And here's our wonderful, good-looking panelists here, and delighted to welcome for one. We're going to edit this. Thank you, Joanne. He's in your hand already for that. Yeah, delighted to welcome yet. Okay, right. Okay. It's like that. I know you're on holiday, everybody, but let's try and get through the next hour without raising our hands, okay? You're on the beach, but you've dialed in because we've got some really super exciting stuff to cover off in the next hour. So delighted to welcome, back by popular demand, Ocorian's Mark Spiers, Layla, Abdel-Spence, and Adrian Harvey. My screen's flashing and blinking with raised hands there. Welcome to this webinar on the failure to prevent fraud. It could be you, not a nod to the National Lottery, just in case you felt lucky this morning. And with the new offence under the Economic Crime and Corporate Transparency Act coming into force on the 1st of September, this session couldn't be more timely. So whether you're in risk compliance or in senior leadership, this webinar is all about giving you the examples, hopefully, checklists, and questions that support you, your teams, and your evidence that reasonable procedures have been undertaken to prevent fraud. And thankfully, we've got a panelists to answer most of your questions. But if you have those burning questions which are challenging you, we're going to take those offline and answer them there afterwards with our colleagues at Ocorian there. These are the questions that we attempt to answer fully, because this is what you signed up for, which includes, what do reasonable procedures look like? What functions are most exposed to fraud? How can you move from a one-off training on fraud prevention to a culture of fraud prevention as well? What are the board and senior management responsibilities? And what does a strong defense look like as well? Lots to cover off. And again, your input is really, really important. We test that out by poll questions. We love our poll questions, and we actually make sure that at the end of the webinar that we actually give you a PDF version of the slides as well. And please note, yes, we love your questions, but please, can you just write those down? That will be super helpful for us. Let's kickstart the webinar off by, let's see, how did this work? Okay, let's relaunch the poll there. By asking our first question, has your firm conducted a formal fraud risk assessment that identifies risk exposure to fraud? Has your firm conducted a formal fraud risk assessment that identifies risk exposure to fraud? Single choice answer there. But before we get going on this and interpret the poll results there, Mark, give us an overview and the lowdown on why this is not just another piece of legislation, but a wake-up call for firms.
I think it's really the senior management element that really stands out here. The firms that we've got on this webinar today, most if not all will be regulated, most if not all by the FCA, and this piece of legislation brings in a criminal liability for failures by senior management to do something, and in this case it's the failure to prevent fraud. And you can then draw a straight line between a failure of an individual or a misdeed by an individual through to the failure by senior management to implement reasonable procedures. And I think this is the real sort of key to this one, is that straight line between that failure to implement reasonable procedures and a corporate criminal liability, and then the nexus with the FCA and their oversight of firms and their regulation of firms, and what they may do to a senior manager in a firm that has been found guilty of this corporate offence.
And Layla, yeah, what's the reason why we asked the opening question on risk assessment, fraud risk assessment? Why have we prioritised that?
Well, the risk assessment is the pillar of this new legislation, and in general, the risk assessments should be the pillars of your procedures. Is the risk-based approach, which we talk about all the time. So, where is your highest risk? In order for the firm to put the controls. So very important.
And so when you look at these results that you've got on the screen, 11% Mark saying no, not yet started their fraud risk assessment, currently in progress, 26%, 16 yes.
Over a year old.
Yeah, yes, yeah. Do you gasp, or you're not surprised?
I'm not particularly surprised. The 11% of you who haven't started, I am relatively surprised about that. Yeah, most firms have some form of fraud risk assessment in place already. It might not be targeted strictly at all of the offences that this new offence covers. But yeah, we've certainly seen in our client base some significant firms who are still currently in progress. So the 62 people, 26% who are in progress. You're not alone. For the 11% that have not started, I think it's, last chance saloon time to get started.
Yeah, Layla, you wanted to come on that. You're raising your eyebrows above your glasses, so
if the business risk assessment is over a year old, I would count that one as probably in progress, because remember that the risks evolve all the time, and one of the requirements is to do this risk assessment on a yearly basis, same as with the policies, every year.
And when we look at our next poll question here, I mean, we're drilling down in a bit more detail here. So please reflect on your answer. Again, it's a single choice answer in this case. So how confident are you that the effectiveness of your current fraud controls would meet the legal test of reasonable procedures? That will come up time and time again in this webinar, obviously. But how confident are you that the effectiveness of your current fraud controls, and I'm assuming that those 11% might not necessarily have that much confidence around that if they haven't actually started writing that. How confident are you that the effectiveness of your current fraud controls would meet the legal test of reasonable procedures? There, it's safe to say that the 6 principles that the guidance offers should be a bit of an indication of how you would go about that. But Layla, it's all about control, isn't it?
Yes, remember when we talk about reasonable procedures, we talk about proportionate to the risk, and to prevent and detect fraud, and practical. That part of the practical is when regulators and auditors are coming to you and say, how do you know that the procedures and the controls are working? Did you calculate it, that percentage? Did you guess that percentage? How do you know it's working?
And you called it, I mean, you said, Adrian, all right, okay, you've obviously got a crystal ball. Yeah, 70% you said were unsure, somewhat confident in their control framework around fraud. Still very confident, 17%, 3%. Yeah. Thank you for your honesty, by the way, the 3% on that one there. But no surprises there. That middle of the road, grey man is 70%-ish, or even more than that, actually.
Is that addressed to me?
Yeah.
Okay. It's what we talked about earlier. I'm surprised we're at 17% and very confident on attending the webinar.
Mark, when you look at this and you think, well, policies and controls in place, but not quite fully tested against the new offence, that's slightly concerning, isn't it? We've got them in place, but we haven't put them, tested them in anger.
Yeah, I suspect there's a design and operational effectiveness question here that I think Layla will be talking about later on. But I suspect that going through the risk assessment, many firms have looked at the design of their policies and controls and have come to the conclusion that the design of them appears to be appropriate to the size, complexity, and risk that they're facing, but they probably haven't gone through the operational effectiveness side of those, and that will probably come out over the next months as they work through a monitoring program around those controls to work out if they're effective in practice.
So apart from the diehards, which all of you are, all 400 of you are the diehards and the super cool cats who just live and breathe this, even if you're on Bournemouth Beach today. But for those people who think, well, goodness me, why should it matter? Talk to us about that, Adrian.
Well, funny enough, I'm going to talk about today. My hobby horse is going to be your people, your employees, because your employees in relation to this legislation are your weakest link. And I've got some statistics here to back this up. The National Crime Agency says that 20% of frauds perpetrated in the corporate space were perpetrated by your own employees deliberately, which is, I think, a really stark issue. But I think more importantly, fraud in the last 12 months, 3% of firms have fallen victim to this. It's 40,000 firms. Yeah, it's an incredible statistic, all of which were perpetrated through cybersecurity. And by the way, 95% of successful cybersecurity attacks are successful because an employee who has previously been trained, and doubtless receives simulations every month, let the criminal in through the front door. So my point through this webinar is going to be, if you are relying on your current, in most instances, inappropriate and outdated training practices, you're going to be part of that statistic in the future. Ticking boxes in relation to this is not going to create an effective first line of defense. It's just going to expose you.
Agreed there. So our first question that we want to kickstart this webinar on is, what does reasonable procedures actually look like in practice, and how can you evidence that you've done enough? So first up, the eagle-eyed of you would actually notice that you've got the 6 principles, but the principles have been reordered, Mark, in there. And top of the pops, or top of the list, is board level ownership. That's a slight distinction from other 6 guiding principles that we've seen with other previous legislations, but it's an important distinction. Why?
Well, I think it goes back to that senior manager point again, and who is going to take charge of this within the firm. If it doesn't have that board level support, you're not going to get an adoption throughout the firm. We've also got as part of this legislative package, the removal of the guiding will and mind point. So actions of the senior managers, of which boards must be, are going to be taken into consideration when looking at whether the corporate has got reasonable procedures in place and whether they then are guilty or not guilty of the strict liability offence. So I think, tone from the top, the board, it's absolutely crucial. I suspect that many of the firms, looking at those polls that we've had, many of the firms are going through a process with their boards on risk assessment, on thinking about this, on that sort of tone from the top, and so are sort of in progress. I'm thinking that in September there are going to be a number of board meetings to address this and get that tone from the top set right at the right at the outset. But yeah, if it's not owned fully and totally at that board level, you're not going to be successful.
Layla, I mean, as a former regulator yourself, then when you see the quotation by Nick F. Grave of the SFO there, I mean, that's not leaving much to the imagination here, is it?
Not really. And what is one of the requirements from the regulator when the firms are, when the information request is sent at first, is the board minutes where all the policies, the procedures, and the risk assessments have been discussed, as well as the management information. They want the excerpt from the minutes, and which is an assessment of which kind of challenges are the board members raising. What is the paper? What is the place to challenge all that, the information which is coming? Is there any information or is only one page saying that everything is working in place, and all the examples are generic examples of what is happening in the market? But what is that kind of bespoke information to the firm where they give them assurance where things are working from the operational perspective and the design perspective?
And then Adrian, we've paired training and culture together there for a reason, because, I would argue that, training is an indicator of culture and also your approach to developing anti-fraud culture within your firm around that. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, yes, I think Layla's point is, in my parlance, sorry to put words in your mouth, Layla, it's about doing it properly. Yeah. Have you genuinely got a culture where you are testing and refining what you are doing, or are you ticking boxes, going to board meeting and ticking boxes? Same goes for training. How many of you out there work in firms where you have an annual refresher? You have a fraud policy. It gets dealt to you when you join. Every year you sign it. Yeah. Every year you get a refresher, and then you get back on with your work. This is this sort of default model, and I think it falls woefully short. I think that, and we'll talk about it in a bit more detail as we go on. I'm just conscious of the time. But here's my prediction, right? I reckon, Nick, in the event of a prosecution post the 1st of September that isn't insider dealing or insider instigated, I bet you training is cited as one of the reasons for that prosecution, or failure to adequately train employees. I bet you that appears. So for all of you sat out there thinking, oh, well, that's L&D's problem, I think that's a dangerous conclusion.
But for people who aren't used to our webinars, this is Adrian Mic Drop Harvey on broadcasting here, and you'll get nuggets of those throughout the webinar. So hold on to your seats, folks.
It is holiday season, Philip.
It is holiday season. So, Layla, we've talked about what's required to an extent, but how do you evidence that you've done enough and firms have done enough on this webinar? Talk us through one of the key points on this slide.
Well, definitely on the controls. When the firms are have been selected, it's very important to show that on the first, second, and third line of defense, there is management information. That's the evidence that the design, those policies and procedures are working in real life. So on your compliance, how many tests do you do on a regular basis, on a monthly basis? Your audit departments, have they done any testing? So the evidence is there. Just remember, Monzo, all the design of the policies were there. But have they tested on real environments? So it's hard evidence really to make sure that the policies and procedures work in real life. Is the operational effectiveness. Remember, when visits are done, you have all the documentation, but then the regulator will go on the site and then request a series of client files of transactions, and then make sure that everything has a reason either to clear, has a reason to, when the firm make a decision on if anything is high risk, and how you deal with that high risk. What have you done? So is the evidence really how the operational effectiveness of the design.
And so certainly throughout the webinar, we'll be giving you checklists and also asking questions that you can take away to ask questions of your own organization, and also the effectiveness and the robustness of your control. So again, we want to reiterate that the slides will be sent over to you. We'll be highlighting key points around this webinar, and not all the points that are listed on particular slides here. So question number 2, obviously teams and functions exposed under the new offence have been highlighted and will be highlighted throughout the webinar, but not all functions have the same risk exposure, Layla. Different teams, different stresses and strains on that, but the fraud triangle, which you see on the right-hand side, Mark, I would suggest you're still going to get pressures, opportunities, and rationalizations that are going to drive certain behaviors of all these job areas there. You don't want to pick 1 or 2 areas that maybe firms should be looking at a bit more closely at, or forensically testing the controls that Layla has suggested that each firm does.
Yeah, so I think if you think about where this is going, it's serious misconduct. That's what we're really looking at here, and I think you've got a number of areas in regulated firms where some of this will manifest. I would pick on probably the finance and treasury function, just from a accounting perspective and being in charge of how our accounts look and whether we're misrepping those. But equally, people who are involved in product management, maybe some of the front office pieces, if there's pressure to present products in a certain way, to sell more, because as we all know at the moment, P&Ls are under pressure across UK, PLC and beyond. Pressure to sell, pressure to make sure that your product is out there, service is out there. So there is that potential misrep point. One can also draw a line between maybe some of the ESG certifications and here we've seen some ESG issues that can manifest in front office client facing roles, but I'd probably go for finance and treasury if
This speaks of culture, doesn't it, Adrian? In a way, and certain cultures will drive the behaviors that you see on the triangle on the right hand side.
Yeah, we spoke about this beforehand, and we were talking about how the drivers of crime and what would drive somebody to commit fraud, and culture could be one of them. As times get tough and leadership put more pressure on the organization and failed, encouraging people to do better is not necessarily in and of itself a bad thing, but just blindly putting people under pressure and not providing them with the support and maybe more support, more development to be able to do that, more well-being sort of stuff. You have to expect that some people may succumb to that, and the data's there, right? The more pressure you put, the more performance pressure culture you have, the higher the fraud likelihood. And I happened to work for a large energy firm once, and they experienced fraud, interestingly, Mark, at the front office, and that fraud was a theft of data by phones from screenshots, and that data was sold to energy brokers. And to answer the question that somebody posed anonymously, how did we find that out and what do we do to that? We had very clear data sets that told us how certain things performed. And as soon as we saw an anomaly, like that outlier, investigate them. We don't necessarily know it was fraud, but we saw that it was an outlier because we were managing our business. To Layla's point, we had a control framework. We knew what we expect in terms of normality. When it stepped outside that, something was wrong. We investigated. We found it was significant fraud.
And that is only because of management information.
Ding dong, and the regulator and the SFO, they're going to want genuine data. And to be honest, you're shooting yourselves in the foot if you're not doing it properly anyway, because you'd never spot that. You know, you're kidding yourself, right? You should be investing in it. Anyway, hobby horse, I'll get off.
Layla, it's all about prioritization. I mean, we talk about risk exposure. And firms will be screaming at us and say, well, look, that's very nice indeed. But how do we prioritize that? So what are the first steps in the prioritization to help firms manage what could be another risk that they have to deal with?
Again, through the risk assessment. So when you enter to assess your inherent risk exposure, obviously, you are going to take scenario-based risk reviews based on your own business model. Then, based on that, you will determine what is high, what is medium, and what is low. And then which controls do you have in place? And then you have the residual risk. Just make sure that every single calculation from the very beginning to the end is based on any kind of information. It's not a guessed point.
So here's one we prepared earlier, you see, in true Peter fashion. Here's an example matrix there. Sorry, I interrupted you, Layla. So, and this, talk us through the fraud exposure matrix. That is just an example. It's just an illustration as opposed to a playbook that you can cut out and keep. And there, is this the type of thing that organizations should be looking at and actually personalizing it to themselves? That's a nod to you, Layla.
Sorry. So yes, examples of what do you have the fraud exposure matrix. So you have on the first line of defense where there is a direct contact with customers and is access to the client accounts. I saw a couple of times in the regulator where although there were controls in place, there were clients well known by the board, and they allowed them to come through without doing any kind of sanctions, screenings, anything. And this is a very good example of a tone from the top plus working on a control environment and a whistleblowing. And we learned this through a whistleblowing. So is something that will have everything in place and the training on whistleblowing, because all those elements were in place. The regulator learned what was happening from the very beginning of the operation to the end. And this is a case that was referred to enforcement. So this is an example of the exposure, the inherent exposure of a high risk client, where the design was in place. Obviously, the effectiveness of the control didn't work because from the very top, the controls were lifted.
Okay, a nice segue into training, by the way, because there's one thing to do the training, be it whistleblowing and also being it fraud training. There's another thing to actually develop and create a culture of fraud prevention. So the question is, posing it to you as we put our third poll on the screen, is Adrian, how do we get started on creating that culture? One thing to and move away from that tick box approach to training to developing a culture where people are aligned, accountable, and also improvements are made, significant improvements, data, data evidenced improvements are made in terms of like behavioral change there? What's the starting points for firms on this webinar?
I think one of our insurance customers put it very wisely that they had been measuring the wrong thing. They'd been measuring the completion of training and taking that as a proxy for competence or good outcome. And that's very dangerous. And all the evidence actually all the evidence points to the fact that that is not a proxy for competence. You should be measuring in role competence. And that will give you data at an individual level. This will give you a forward-facing risk radar in terms of where actual exposure is in the organization. It shouldn't be something you run away from. It should be something you actively mine. And obviously that's our mantra, and what all our customers have bought into is a continual assessment methodology at an individual level where we can understand what people know and what they don't know and help them translate that into the actual required competence, Layla, to the level of risk in that individual organizational function.
Yes, only to complement, and sorry to interrupt, very important point in here is when breaches are reported and near breaches are reported, one important exercise is the root cause, and the root cause can be attached to that training or failure or circumvention of controls. What is the root cause? Then you attack the root cause, and if it's the training or generic training, which is tailored to your business model, so that people they're running business, they don't understand what is it.
Yeah.
What was the phrase, Philip? One size fits all training fits none.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly. And the guidance is really clear on this. That training has to be personalized. It also has to be measured, and also the effectiveness. And I thought this was a game changer for me, Adrian, which was monitoring the effectiveness of your training. It's there. It's on page 35, I think, of the guidance which you posted in there. I think that's a seismic change. It's recommended. It's not. But I think that to show a clean pair of heels, that's what you would do as an organization, and to evidence and monitor it, but with the data to prove.
Yeah.
That's the point, Philip. I mean, they mentioned the Home Office mentions training, the importance of training, I think 22 times. Yeah. So they're on it. And it's not just ticking a box. It's this ability to be able to do your risk assessments, understands where the risks lay relative to that individual and the function they perform, make sure you've trained them, make sure that training has translated into the required competence, and then continually assess it and take feeds from your QA or whatever other measures you're doing to ensure that actually your policy, procedures and training is correct and up to date. And then gather all of that data and present it in whatever form you want in the evidence that you are doing so properly. I think most people would look at that and say we're a million miles away from them.
So what's your response then, Adrian, to the 59% that said they do annual?
Thanks for being honest. I know, because I speak to people who say that to me every day. And in many instances, genuinely, and I've got a lot of sympathy, because actually the vast majority of people I speak to who would tick that box say it's not through choice. We know we should be doing better here. We either don't have the budget, we don't have the appetite, C-suite don't prioritize this, we've got other things going on, like whatever, depends on what market they're on, whatever the big thing in that market is at the moment. Imagine car finance sector. This is going to get kicked into the weeds. So in my experience, compliance and professionals are not saying, oh yeah, this is the problem and it's with my blessing. They're saying the opposite. They're saying we do this and it's not with my blessing, but it's the best we can do at this point in time with the budgets and culture that prevails in this organization.
Yeah. And this is not about a culture of teaching people what not to do, Mark, is it? I mean, it's a bit more nuanced than that. Hopefully we've evolved into a better, more cultured way, of actually approaching behavioral change and mindset change. Which one out of the six, there, which you'd say, will actually shift the dial in a firm's approach to an anti-fraud culture?
So I'm going to go back to my tone from the top. If the board doesn't really believe allows unethical behavior to continue, decides that actually we don't particularly mind if, you know, people slightly make up the figures along the way. You know, it starts off as non-criminal, can very quickly descend into sort of the criminal behavior. You know, if we just tweak this, recognize that revenue next quarter, or recognize the revenue this quarter, then that'll be great. That's the sort of thing that starts to dip towards the unethical, and then you're on a slippery slope to the criminal along the way. And this has happened, and it's been shown to happen in many cases where tolerances are pushed, and people say, yes, but if you just do this, you know, then it starts to really shift the culture all the way down an organization.
We've talked a lot. Sorry, Layla, did you want to jump in on that point?
For me, yes, for me it's evidence. I still have this kind of regulator mind, regulator hat, and is what I can see. How can you prove that this is working? And then numbers.
Evidence and the accountability of that evidence to show, as my parlance, a clean pair of heels, Mark, is, you know, lies with the board and senior managers. Obviously, there's talk about changes to SMCR. Would that impact at all? If so, on firms' approach to fraud prevention, on that?
So I think for this particular fraud, you know, we're talking about the most serious frauds that benefit the organization and ergo probably benefit their shareholders. And this offence then creates that sort of strict liability offence. And we talk about reasonable procedures because the only defence to that strict liability offence is to demonstrate reasonable procedures. One of the suggested amendments to the senior managers regime, or one of the original ideas, was to reverse the burden of proof on senior managers. So if something had gone wrong, you would have to demonstrate that you had done the right thing. And actually, this offence basically does that for the regulator. You know, you have a strict liability offence. You have to demonstrate as an organisation that you had reasonable procedures. If you cannot demonstrate you had reasonable procedures, then clearly someone must be responsible for that failure. And ergo, a senior manager, under the senior managers regime, you can probably start to draw some lines. You know, the suggestions, I think, in the SM&CR regime are mainly around the sort of certified element of it. And therefore, you know, yes, there will be some people who will be taken out with maybe the SM&CR regime in the future, but I don't think anybody's talking about removing those senior managers from the regime or reducing their obligations. So in relation to this particular one, I don't think, and, you know, always a hostage to fortune, but I don't think that that sort of the proposals on the table are pretty much going to do much in this space.
And again, we talked about developing that culture. We've got at the bottom of this, supporting a speaker culture, talking about Layla, reviewing and updating the risk assessment and making second line accountable and third line accountable to that. So really duty of responsibilities throughout the organisation to make sure. And this one is, well, going back to your point, Adrian, ensuring adequate resources and budgets for training as part of enhancing your risk controls around that. Interesting, Layla, from a regulator's perspective, I see in my mind's eye SFO and FCA doing a Marvel tag team or a Marvel team up there as well there. Talk us through, from the mindset of a regulator, what regulators will be looking for and expecting to see from organisation from the 1st of September onwards.
I don't think it's is going to be any procedures just yet on testing the operational effectiveness of the entire framework. But it will be, if we see any thematic reviews, it will be on the design. And by design is on the risk assessments. I have seen thematics in other areas of money laundering, anti-money laundering, where across the board they are requesting only one document, which is in the case of AML is the business-wide risk assessment. And then through that document, they can see if the firms understand where are the highest risk. But I don't think it will be any effectiveness just yet. Probably within the next 3 to 6 months, another thematic will come. But at first, the expectation would be to request the risk assessment on this part. Just make sure that everything is in order and supported with evidence. No,
Adrian, you've been on boards. Mark, you've advised boards and still do advise boards on that. And what type of questions will you as a board member or advising a board member be asking a board to be able to answer there? Because a number of people on this webinar will be taking away this slide deck and actually thinking, can we really answer these questions? Well, it starts off by asking the questions in the first place. Adrian, point number 2, what questions around training should the board members be asking?
My favourite question is why? Because it really unearths so many things. Why and how do we know? So usually we've trained people. How do we know that that's been effective would probably be my first question. Will they pass the tests? And how do we know that that is adequate and sufficient relative to the regulations? And that second is usually, Philip, the second question that unearths the gold. Rarely is it the first question. Have we done it? Binary answer, yes, no. Assume yes, I'll move on. That, in my opinion, is a weak culture. Not that you're out looking to catch people out, but as a board, you have a responsibility to shareholders, not least, and the business, yeah, to ensure that you understand what's actually going on. And that means that you have to ask questions at a deeper level and continue to ask questions and not have, what's my favorite phrase of last month, watermelon reporting. Green on the outside, and when you peel it back, it's all red in the middle. So I just think it's the second and third questions. You need a curious, appropriately curious, not witch hunting culture. Because if it's witch hunting, people will lie.
Yeah, correct. Mark, tone from the top is your, that's your golden thread throughout this webinar there. Questions that board should be asking themselves about their approach to fraud.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting one in the light of sort of Adrian's witch hunting comment. I would be looking at how we have thought about near misses and cases that have come up to that sort of level. What have we done? You know, it's not a witch hunt, it's not a blame culture, but ultimately, have we disposed of those in the right way? What did we find were the root causes, and then what have we done about it after that over time would be the sort of the starting point for me.
You've jumped the gun to point 7 on this screen, and their instant responses and learning, lessons learned. I like that from near misses. Layla, your golden thread throughout this webinar is controls and assessments there. Talk us through some of the key questions on point number 5 that you think that boards should be asking themselves.
Yes, the first one is, are they documented anti-fraud policies and controls in place? Probably at this point, many firms, they found a lot of generic policies and procedures from all different sources. Just make sure that the policies are tailored to your business model. Are they any third-party fraud risk managed through the due diligence? Just make sure that your risk assessment includes the third-party risk exposure. are for prevention procedures proportionate and tailored to the business model? The answer to this question will come only when you can test those controls. So operational effectiveness will tell you if the controls are proportionate and tailored to the business model. So management information, really.
So question number 5, and I think this is an important one, and certainly in our research of the webinar, this is what firms wanted to know. What does a strong or defence look like in the face of what the regulatory expectations are, and obviously 3 weeks to go? You know, if we get caught in the headlights of the SFO, what do we do to evidence and demonstrate what that looks like as a robust defence? Layla, kick us off. And we talked about in your last answer, MI and data there. That leads into points number 1 and 2 there. This is what everything really hangs off, doesn't it? You talked about the risk assessment, but also effective controls there. Where do firms go wrong on their control framework, and what could they do to address it?
Very, very much to the point. Avoid generic. Avoid guesses. Make sure that you have evidence to support the business-wide risk assessment, the risk assessment. Do you really understand which inherent risk inherent do you have? Do you really understand how do you, if your controls work properly? Now, on the residual risk, that is the risk that you need to be focused on. Is your compliance plan linked to that residual risk? How are you managing that residual risk? How are you monitoring the residual risk? Do you have management information on a regular basis of that residual risk? So it's the proportionate part.
On point number 4, Adrian, the guidance cites that it's critical that when individuals change jobs or they're onboarded into a new role or a new job on the firm, that they get training. And in some firms, that training only lands 12 weeks or even 4 months after they've started. When they've gone through the cycle of doing all their other training, they suddenly get landed with fraud training there. I don't think that's in the spirit of the guidance, the expectation of the guidance to do that, to have that approach, you know, 4 months after you just new into role, or alternatively you change jobs.
Hey, look, I think I can't disagree with that, right? And then if you look at the flip side of it, Tarquin joins and the next day he's given 30 pieces of online training to complete that takes him 3 days. So from my point of view, that it's somewhat irrelevant whether you've waited 90 days to bombard him with a huge training curriculum or whether you've done it on his first week. The likelihood of him actually learning and comprehending and then putting into practice that training, policies and procedures is negligible, which one way or another you have to have an evidence that you have served or shared those policies and procedures. What then that's not learning, right? That's called serving content. The job to be done then is to take that learning and help the individual translate it into in-role competence. And that doesn't happen overnight. That's why kids go to school for 15 years. If you just did the thing, did the e-learning and press the button, they'd be out of school in 6 months. So it's just not how the brain works. So to answer your question, I would take a different stance and I would ensure that all the content was served and it was available for the individual to reference wherever they want. And then I would do a continual assessment basis to understand what the individual understands, doesn't understand, where the gaps are, complete the gaps, and help them translate that into in-role competence, which is what is going to give you a robust first line of defence.
Hey, you must have been in Blackpool because the kids are out after 6 weeks, let alone 6 months of school. And before you naysayers say, I'm from Blackpool, so I live in Blackpool. I'm there. So, Mark, effective monitoring and response, because this is a living document, isn't it? It's a living adherence to regulatory expectations.
Yeah, so I think the key here is that sort of learning organization. We've talked a lot about learning around people. This is about the sort of the learning and improving the organization. As part of the sort of the reasonable procedures, your defense against the strict liability offence, you're going to have to demonstrate that your organisation learns over time, that it takes into consideration the MI that we've talked about, the incidents we've talked about, all of those areas, and that you review and improve it over time. And as Layla said, you know, the key document, the risk assessment, it's not one and done, it's a living document. And so you can always see this sort of circular piece of assess, put controls in place, reassess, amend controls, and that's super important in this area. And of course, the regulator, the FCA, is concerned about financial crime in total, and so we'll be asking you for specific risk assessments in this area over time, in common with the other financial crime areas that it's concerned about.
And mistakes to avoid, we've listed 7 here. We could have gone on for a couple more pages there, Layla. Where do you see key challenges that firms on this webinar can and should avoid?
Well, my favorite one is the risk assessments that are extremely generic, and then calculations of likelihood, probability, and controls being calculated based on guessing. So there is no methodology around any of the calculations behind. How do you know that something is working or is not working? How do you know that you have a high exposure on one side and not to the other side? Remember, you need to make the most of the resources you have, because I know that the compliance departments have lots to do. And this is the reason for the risk-based approach. Focus on the highest risk areas. And that is only, the answer is on those risk assessments. And then I'm going to take over from Adrian, his favorite, because effectiveness of training, and only because I have seen few questions on training. How do you know that training is effective? There are 2 ways. Test at the end of the training, yes, but also when your training has a case-based scenarios only on your own business model, and then people can detect that something that is going through an unusual transaction, something they have seen in that training is not common, then this is how you spot that training is working. It should be a way to think about management information also on breaches and near misses, and you can link that training with that data. So data is going to be your best friend going forward.
And I think that when we look at common mistakes and challenges, it's if I'm summarizing, and jump in if I'm not doing this appropriately, lack of senior leadership, ownership, getting a robust risk assessment in place, making sure that your training actually fits real life scenarios and experiences of your company or your firm, and not just some sort of ad hoc or alternatively something that's separate from your business because you've just bought it off an e-learning provider there. These are hygiene factors that firms, and obviously we've got the super cool people on this webinar, are doing. And some of this, as you will experience on this webinar, has just been a reinforcement of what you are doing already. But we hope that this has sense checked what you are doing already as organizations. And if it hasn't, and then please let us know, give us that feedback. We'll be welcome to receive that there. We also like to invite you as a final offering to indicate your interest in discussing how Ocorian could help you and support you in your fraud approach to anti-fraud procedures, policies, and that all-important risk assessment and there. And supported ably by Mark and Layla there. We'd also like to discuss with you how Elephants Don't Forget's approach to training and learning can develop a strong anti-fraud culture. And as ever, both our organizations have oodles of content and support in terms of like webinars, podcasts, thought leadership papers to support your approach to financial crime in general, but also specifically as we lead up towards the 1st of September, got assets and materials that can support you adhere and understand this further there. Final thoughts from panelists. Adrian, starting with you, then Mark, and then Layla, wrapping up what firms could be doing or should be doing, apart from packing up their bucket and spades and getting back to their laptop to refine their risk assessments. What else could they be doing?
Well, for me is please test your controls.
Yeah. Data. I'm going to say data. Your controls are useless unless you've got data to put them. You know, what are you testing? So you've got your policy. How are you testing it if you haven't got reasonable, sensible data? And for those suggesting that I train my people and that's a proxy for competence, I don't think so.
And I go back to my tone from the top and also put it all together with the rest of your anti-financial crime procedures and your framework. This is all tied together. Things that you're doing in one area can certainly benefit other areas. So make sure you're coordinated. Yes, this is the focus of the webinar in the next month, but over time, you need to have that holistic view, what you're doing in if you have market abuse or if you have anti-money laundering requirements, and how all of this goes together and helps you make that sort of strong anti-financial crime culture in all of the areas that you have.
Couple of questions that may have come up in the chat there you want to pick off before we close there. Anything that we can give a brief answer to or a brief response to?
We will definitely be sending the slides out. That's the last question that we've had. There've been a couple of questions around who's responsible as SMF. There's usually a board level person who has overall responsibility for financial crime. That's probably where this sits. It's not naturally the MLRO because they are the oversight, not the person who has to take responsibility for implementing, and they generally don't have all of the money available. So it's a board level person.
Good. And if there are any questions that you would like answered in...
Will the slides be sent out? Someone's asked.
Yeah, you can even put your hand up if you want. We won't answer it because we're going to go in 30 seconds. But if you do have any burning questions that you want answered by Mark, Adrian and Layla, please do reach out to them. We will make sure their contact details are with you in the response. Thank you very much for giving up your bucket and spade and your suntan as well for this webinar. Enjoy the rest of your summer. See you soon. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Well done. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.